third speaker, Marina Richter, from HES-SO Valais in Switzerland. She wrote her presentation with Irene Marti and Ueli Hostettler, and its title is Conceptualizing and Exploring Coercive Space-Time Regimes.
Thank you. Thank you to all the organizers for this great conference. It's great that this works, even though we are all online and in different places. I'm talking from Switzerland, so it's at least the same time as in Brussels, but some kilometers away. So you already mentioned, Christoph, that we are a team. Because of technical reasons, I'm speaking alone, but it's important to say that because these are not only my thoughts, even if I'm expressing them alone at the moment. And also to say that I will be talking about the conceptual part of a project that has just received funding during this Corona year. We were really happy to get money in these times, and we will start on 1st of January of next year. So it's really about the conceptual thinkings, and this is also the reason why we don't have or have not included any nice pictures, because there is no data. So if you need a picture, look at the heart behind me that my daughter drew for me. That's the only picture you will see in this presentation. I'm sorry. Okay. Our point of departure lies in the prisons as institutions and in the prison-like nature of some institutions. More in general, institutions are the backbone of societal modes of organization and management of the members of society. While most members of society are perceived as being sufficiently managed by general institutions, such as education, the legal system, or the labor market, some members are seen in need of specialized institutions. Reasons for not fitting into normal standards of society or as being unmanageable, as we call them, include legal, citizenship status, age, or mental health. The institutions linked to these groups of people are prison, asylum centers, nursing homes, and psychiatric hospitals. Such institutions have lately come under critique as not only dealing with troubled people, but also being troubled institutions themselves, as Disney and Schlier have argued. In a similar direction points the debate about the carceral, as in terms such as the carceral age or the carceral term, the carceral also expanding into other institutions. So with this project, we therefore aim at tracing and comparing the carceral in these 4 different institutions and understand how they are potentially, the carceral characteristics are potentially increasing and how this is linked to the often cited carceral term. Based on our research experience in the prison context, and in particular also inspired by Dominique Morin, we propose in this paper to trace the potential carcerality of these institutional regimes and principles of management by focusing not only on the spatial dimension of coercion and related restrictions of movement, but also on the institutional ways of using time as a principle of management. More concretely, we propose to use the notion of space-time regime, which we basically understand as formal sets of arrangements of space and time through which the institution establishes a particular spatio-temporal order. We argue that through specific space-time regimes, institutions organize individuals in specific ways, restricting their freedom of movement and autonomy to varying degrees. The use of space-time regimes as an analytical lens for the exploration of contemporary mechanisms and processes, as well as the experience of social exclusion, will open a unique and fruitful perspective on carceral and potentially carceral institutions. This perspective allows us to not only explore the concrete characteristics of these coercive spaces, but also to compare them in search of commonalities and differences. Conceptualizing coercion in prison-like institutions in terms of space and time is rooted and inspired by a research tradition that only starts with the work of Foucault. As already showed by Foucault, space as well as time can be considered the main elements on which the modern penal system, which developed in the late 18th century, is built. The segregation of offenders in particular plays the prison from the rest of society over a certain period. Moreover, the prison at first sight may basically be conceived as, I quote, a context where clock time moves on, but space is fixed, as Morin said. Furthermore, prison life is characterized by particular spatial deprivations, such as restricted liberty of movement and mobility within the prison, limited connection to the outside world, and the division of prisoners by sex. Everyday management of the inmates, as well as disciplinary sanctions, are also to a great extent spatial in nature. We all know that. Furthermore, due to institutional constraints in prison, as stressed by Matthews, I quote, although imprisonment is in essence about time, from the point of view of prisoners, it is experienced as a form of timelessness, which prisoner term often as doing or killing time. However, regarding research on prisons, a division of labor has been established between criminologists and carceral geographers in dealing with time and space, the former tending to exclusively look at the temporal and the latter primarily focusing on the spatial dimension of incarceration. The same goes for research on other institutions. So by considering both space and time, by means of the concept of the space-time regime, we contribute to growing influence of efforts from studies in carceral geography and criminology. More concretely, we argue that these more or less total institutions, which are responsible for the temporary or permanent accommodation of unmanageables, all impose a particular more or less coercion-oriented space-time regime to manage and regulate those they confine. Moreover, the arrangement and experience of space-time in these institutions contrasts increasingly with experience in society at large, which is characterized by ubiquity through virtual reality, as we are experiencing at the moment, and the omnipresence of digitally connected worlds through devices such as cell phones, computers, the shortening of space-time distance, and so on. This contrasts starkly with what people experience in prison-like institutions. In the light of current debates on the punitive of carceral term, the space-time regime imposed by institutions such as prisons, as well as centers for asylum seekers, psychiatric hospitals, and even nursing homes, all increasingly troubled themselves, is thus in various ways and to different degrees not only coercive, but potentially also carceral. And this is what we aim to look at. The concept of space-time regime we propose is constituted by the following four elements. So first, it is enforced by technologies and corresponding materialities. Technologies include rules and norms, as well as digital devices such as video cameras. These technologies often materialize in artifacts such as doors, walls, keys, surveillance technology in general, which are not only the means of ensuring the regime, but in themselves incorporate the regime and make the space-time regime a bodily lived experience. Second, this regime, it is enforced, used, challenged, and resisted by practices of individuals, such as inmates, but also people working in and for these institutions. Both groups, the inhabitants who stay in-house at night and the staff who leave for the night, can enforce and challenge the regimes. In most cases, space-time regimes would not function without the compliance of the inhabitants in these institutions, where both sides are intertwined in a delicate network of mutual dependency, not the network of exclusion we heard before, but the network of dependency. A third aspect is that these regimes are, the regime is experienced by the people living and working in the institutions. These experiences may vary according to their position, to the position of the people experiencing them, such as being an inhabitant or a staff member. but also according to the function of the staff, to the length of stay of an inhabitant, or other factors at individual level. These varied experiences from different perspectives provide the key to understanding how and why people perform their everyday practices in these institutions. And fourth, the regime, it is embedded in a complex web of societal and political legitimization, as well as professional reasoning. The four institutions are linked to different professions. Already the question of who is labeled as unmanageable and, in consequence, confined in specialized institution depends on processes of social construction and the definition of the characteristics of unmanageability. Also, the importance of security for whom and at whose expense is intrinsically a social one. Finally, at least some of these specialized institutions are linked to the history of a particular profession, in healthcare, in social work, or in the justice system. The notion of spatio-temporal regime applies basically to rules and their surveillance about who has the right to be where and when. Inmates have cell time, times for eating, working, etc., all restricted to specific spaces. The same also applies to some extent to other carceral-like institutions. At the same time, this also has profound effects on the mobility of people living and working in these institutions. It is not only their presence in certain spaces, but also their absence and movement between and through spaces that is effectively controlled. The restriction of movement of bodies, while thoughts cannot be controlled and reach beyond walls, is an important element of coercion. Just wandering around, a way of moving without any concrete aim, may become suspicious. While a particular space-time regime and related coercive elements can be observed in any institutions applying coercive practices, the question remains what happens when the concept of the carceral travels to other institutions. How is the carceral imposed and potentially transformed, and what are the specific institutional logics of legitimization applied according to different institutions, such as a nursing home, a psychiatric hospital, or an asylum center? Foucault, for instance, proposes the use of the metaphor of a carceral archipelago, we've heard about that already, to address the prison's different forms of mechanisms, technologies, knowledge systems, and networks that mark distinct islands or positions on a carceral continuum, for which he distinguishes between compact and diffuse carceral models. We will explore these institutional space-time regimes, as I said, in a Swiss National Science Foundation funded research project that will start in 2021 and last for 4 years. So for this project, we will compare the above-mentioned 4 specialized institutions, each designed to manage different groups of people that society considers unable to be managed elsewhere. Each institution is studied in depth as a case in order to document and analyze commonalities and differences in their particular time-space regimes. Their interpretation will deepen our understanding of space-time regimes and of their link to societal discourses. For this, we elaborate institutional ethnographies in the tradition of Dorothy Smith, who sees institutions functioning the way they do because of powerful relations that are constantly built and negotiated and influence and organize how people act in these institutions. The concrete empirical process needs a point of departure. We argue that this point of departure could be an event at the threshold between the outside and inside of the institution. This event can be conceptualized as an event of movement into or out of the institution. Inspired by Hertz, we understand an event as a situation that has an identified importance or relevance for the individuals concerned. The empirical work could therefore begin with the event of entering and exiting of such institutions. As shown by Goffman, for institutions he calls total institutions, the event of entering an institution and leaving the outside world behind is a decisive experience for the individual most directly concerned, as it is related to a process that will have significant effects on the individual's sense of civilian self, not least because most people do not enter these institutions willingly. Moreover, we argue that entering is linked to a prior process of being categorized by different experts, medical, psychiatric, legal, etc. The event of exiting is usually foreseen in these institutions. In the nursing home, it is mostly represented by the death of a person, which also clears the responsibilities of the state or the institution. Both movements, in and out, provide potential for focusing on the changes inherent in crossing the threshold and entering or exiting the institution, and with this also its space-time regime. Starting with these threshold events allows to follow selected members of staff and inhabitants inside the institutions to recognize an increasingly sharper picture of the different institutions and their space-time regimes. We use the following, or we propose to use the following ethnographic research methods. Participation and observation, participating in the everyday lives of prisoners, patients, pensioners, inhabitants, and staff to gain insight into institutional rules and routines, to observe daily practices and interactions, to establish trust with potential research participants, and to grasp their lived experiences through informal interviews and their bodily motions.
5 minutes.
Yes, thank you. A second method would be semi-structured interviews. Even though language problems will be an issue in these institutions, we argue that semi-structured interviews with prisoners, patients, pensioners, inhabitants, and staff will be useful as they enable to focus on specific topics relevant to the research and which emerged during fieldwork, during the observation period, while at the same time leaving enough space for the participants to narrate their own experience. A third method would be mobile methods such as walking or go-along interviews to explore in situ people's perceptions of the institutional environment, their engagement in and with the environment, and the objects around them, to get access to their personal biographies, the links between places, and their life histories expressed in associations, memories, and anticipations while moving through the physical and social spaces of each institution. Fourthly, we plan to use visual methods such as photo elicitation to sharpen the awareness, to make the participants look at their familiar environment in an unusual way and thereby get access to their lived experiences. Alternatively, we will ask participants to draw their subjective map of their daily spaces and point out different qualities and usages of the spaces, as well as barriers to movement between spaces. And finally, we will combine these methods with document analysis, analyzing documents including official documents, legal texts, professional ethics, etc., or house rules of the institutions, and of course also everyday internal documents of the institutions, inmate records, staff reports, etc., to obtain information regarding the larger legal policy and institutional framework, to trace historical developments and to get a better understanding of the institution's norms and routines, as well as their concrete handling of unmanageable people for whom they care and whom they control. Our goal was to sketch an analytical lens that allows new ways to capture modes of coercive management of people in troubled institutions. In particular, we aim at understanding how coercive modes of management and, more specifically, their carceral varieties potentially spread through society and enter institutions that have a different history and a different legitimizing logic than the prison. With this approach, we hope to contribute new insights into the debate on the carceral age and the current carceral term by using a comparative and simultaneously in-depth approach. In short, we are interested in analyzing how the concept of the carceral travels into other non-prison but prison-like institutions. Space-time regimes are addressing movement, and at the same time they are constantly challenged by movement. Movement therefore plays an important role at various levels. A first level concerns inhabitants, prisoners, patients, asylum seekers, who are moving into and out of the institution. The first movement is therefore a movement of the body through space, but it is also a movement in the institutional sense. It marks the beginning or the end of the power an institution exerts on individuals in its realm.
2 minutes.
Perfect. The second level addresses the movement of the bodies within the spaces of the institutions, walking from one space to another, moving around, crossing halls, yards to reach other places. It is the movement that is framed, managed, and restricted by the institutional space-time regime. Moreover, the predetermined and restricted possibilities of movement shape the inhabitants' experience of space as well as their embodied experience of time. For instance, perceptions of past, present, and future, and the passage of time, as well as their sense of self. And finally, it is important to acknowledge the methodological level. As we plan to use mobile methods, such as walking interviews, moving in and out and within institutions as researchers, and establishing relationships with inhabitants and staff, movement is both a methodological and an analytical tool intended to capture spatio-temporal experiences of coercion. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Marina. Thanks a lot. I'd like to use my privilege of chairman and to ask the first question. Maybe I'm a little bit obsessed by entry and release, but I've seen this is quite a central topic for you. But I was wondering, we all know that nowadays the carceral tends to evolve to a more progressive management of the entry and more of the release. You are released for a few days, then released with an ankle tag and so on. So how do you intend to study maybe the same evolution into the institutions that you are planning to study? Is this a concern for you, and how did you think about it?
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you. The entry into the institution, usually, as far as we know, because we haven't started the empirical work and we have mostly experience in prisons in Switzerland, but the entry is, of course, there is a step-by-step entry into the system of jurisdiction, into the criminal system as a whole. But the entry into the institution of a prison, it's really entering through the door and maybe leaving your clothes and so on. There are processes. So we are interested in the institutions, not in the criminal system or in the asylum system as general. I think this difference is very important because, so the entry point would be into the institution, and at least the entry point, as far as I see it now, for all these institutions, there's a moment when you enter and when you have to learn about the rules, when you have to learn about this regime, and when you also, this learning makes apparent what are the difference to the way you used to live before. All the movements you cannot choose anymore by yourself. So this is why we chose this moment, because people are really experiencing, maybe they are shocked, whatever, but they can really tell you what they experience as different and how this difference, how they feel about this difference. The exiting can, and I think there you're right, the exiting can be also in steps. I mean, if someone dies in a nursing home, it's a final moment. But well, also dying, we wrote about dying in prison, so dying usually is a process, it's not a moment. So also this, the exiting, yes, it will be more of a process, but then there will be the moment when the institution releases you. And we will have to think about how to tackle this, on the one hand, process of leaving in order to make people able to live outside the prison or the institution. But then also looking specifically at this moment when people really are leaving the institution for good, hopefully.
Yes, maybe the question there is there moments when you are free when you escape all these institutions, and that's maybe a concern. I mean, for me. But I have another question. Thanks so much, Marina. I'm particularly interested in movement as a method. Could you say a little bit more about this with regards to these different closed institutions?
Yes. In part, these are methods we have already used, because how to apprehend space and time and the usage and the being of people in space and time, if you do this through interviews, people can tell you, of course. But there is so much difference if there are other, or at least an interview has to combine with other methods, we believe, to get all this. We had for the sensory ethnography, so to have this sensory aspects of the material, what it's experiencing, the material conditions and constraints is something very bodily. And of course you can talk about it, but you also, as a researcher, you need to experience it yourself, but also people will talk differently when they, for example, walk you around the place and tell you, this is the place where we do something, or where I feel most restricted because. So the place and the materiality of the place helps the people to talk or to show their sensory implication in this materiality. So what we will do, we will try to, and this then of course depends on the institution, and for instance on the mobility, I mean just the physical mobility of people in a nursing home. Maybe people can't just take us around and walk us around because they are not that mobile anymore just by their physical conditions. So of course we need to adapt the methods also to the institutions and to the people in these institutions. There's also the language issue, like in an asylum center, we do speak some languages, but not all languages that are spoken in an asylum center. We already experienced this problem in prisons. So the idea is to do walking interviews, like walking around and talking, or to have people draw their mental map of where they move around during the day, and also to see that some spaces are used at different moments of the day, have different connotations. Once they are enabling, in another moment they are constraining, and to also this is a temporal aspect, that the main spaces are always time-space, because they can never be detached from time. They are not the same at another time, and they're experienced through time and body and movement. As this is so central, we also as researchers need to move, and there are different forms of different methodological forms of doing this. This will be a bit experimental, but we're really excited about it. And this is also why the sort of the core principle of the methodology is to do a institutional ethnography. Following Dorothy Smith, it's really getting into the institution and trying to understand the institution through the perspective of the people who do, resist, etc. the institution.
Thanks a lot. I have another question from Jason Danley. I wonder how you'll factor in the primary institution of the family across these different institutions. Also wondering if you anticipate other space-time regimes coming from spiritual or religious institutions, for instance, chaplains, and how this brings other ways of being in space of confinement to the fore.
Yeah, I'm not sure whether this also sort of implies that there are different definitions of institution. The family is an institution, religion is an institution. Yes, of course. This is always a minefield. We say institution and we mean, maybe there I should say organization, the specific organization of one prison. Maybe we would apply here more the term logics, because every one of these institutions has their logic in plural. usually there are different competing logics already in one institutions. From the prison, we know the care and constraints, they always go together. But then, of course, there are other professional logics, for instance, or the from chaplains that introduce. I don't know if they introduce other regimes. We will have to see that, because I very much hope that, or maybe it's a regime of openness. Yes, this could be thought. We have seen that with the spaces of education in prisons, where these spaces had a like the school room, the classroom, if you want to say, where there was a completely different regime, a regime of openness to the world, a regime of accepting inmates as human beings. And this of course opened a completely different space for learning, for trusting, etc. So yes, maybe that's a nice idea to also look at how other logics, professions, etc. bring other time-space regimes into these institutions. Thank you. We didn't think of that. So yes, thank you.
Many thanks, Marina. It's now 10:30, so it's